So I'm just going to show you, by far the most popular thing to go over was UVing for games. And I'm going to just run through like some basic stuff that you can do, because it does go a little bit counter to some of the stuff that I usually advise for animation. There's like a whole crazy like other level of stuff you can do, but it's been several versions of Maya since I've functionally done any of that, so I need to go back and figure out how they actually work in new Maya. I'm just going to pull up my mini town scene if any of you guys are following along. And again, there's no real reason to use this particular scene. I just have some, I guess, like weird little examples of stuff in here. So you'll notice, first thing, that, oh god, because I've been adding a bunch of crap in here. No. Okay. All right. Well, I opened Photoshop because I still can't look at PNG images. So you'll notice each of these different objects. So I have this texture called, oh, thank you, that was fast. So I have this texture called buildings here. And you'll notice that pretty much all of these objects, no matter what color they are, like what material they look like, have this building's texture on them. And that is because I'm using what's called a texture atlas. And this is the texture I have applied. It's basically just like, I think I made it like a 2K text or something, but it just has like a bunch of different like slate textures, wood textures, miscellaneous wall textures that you use for things. And normally this is going to be grouped somewhat logically, like if you have, a single town with like a particular architectural style, you'll make like 1 or 2 atlases for that town and just use them there. The goal being, so a lot of times like in game engines, the more different textures you have, the more draw calls the engine is going to have to make, which takes processing power and can potentially make your game lag. So like on an animation object, it doesn't strictly speaking hurt anything to have, a single human with like 50 different textures on them for like their clothes, their hair, their skin, their eyes are all like 3 different textures. In animation, that doesn't really matter, because I guess render time is, less of an issue or less of a concern. In games, usually you'd have, like a whole person is going to be one single texture. And kind of the same thing for like texture atlases. They'll use this basically to avoid having, 5 different textures in the scene, like 2 different textures for the slates, 2 different textures for individual woods, that kind of stuff. It also does make it really, really easy to modify the textures of whatever color a certain object is. Which I'll go over in a sec, but a lot of times this is also like super commonly used for plants. So it's not uncommon to just sort of, I think, so like for my senior project, I did a game and we actually just had, I think if I remember correctly, we had like a single giant texture atlas for like all of the textures in our town, or like all of the textures on special buildings, and then I just took any free space in those UVs and I just drew like tiny plants everywhere, and we used those for like all of our plant textures. It was like super efficient and horrendous, and it was all like really low pixel plants. It was great. But you can get like really creative and just sort of smash as much stuff into one area as you can as a way to sort of optimize your renders should you need to. Any questions on just like what a texture atlas is? Cool. All right, so if I bust out my UV editor here, everything keeps opening on the wrong monitor. So notice I'm just going to select like all of my town nonsense, and you'll see that the UVs are laid out kind of like in grid chunks based on where those textures are in the UV space. So one thing that's really nice about this is if I decided like I want this particular piece of wood to be the other texture, I'm not crazy about this particular wood, I can just select that UV shell and drag it over and scale it down a little bit because I laid this out terribly. And now it's, a different type of wood. I didn't need to do any texture swapping. I didn't need to swap the model itself. I just modified the UVs. The other thing you can do is, and this goes for especially like stuff like this roof where you have a lot of sort of fairly aggressive repeating textures. So here, I added a little variation by like just taking half of the tiles and just sort of shifting the UVs to a different color slate, which does help to break up the texture. But the other thing that I've gone through and done is I sort of like took some of the UVs and like rotated them around a little bit, just to create, again, a little bit more variation. Because you will notice, so like if you look at, if you look at these particular tiles, you'll notice that they all have the exact same scratches in the exact same spot. If you do this for like the whole roof, it's gonna look kind of trashy. Or not trashy per se, but like it'll be really obvious that you're using the exact same texture for every single tile. So again, what you can do if you have a little bit of extra space to play with in your texture atlas, you can just go through and just sort of like grab UV shells at random and shift them around, maybe rotate them to be different directions, and you can add a lot of variation into your roof just by doing that. So like even if I just sort of scale that a little bit and just be like, aha, now it doesn't look like the exact same texture that's been applied to this other tile. So again, you can just like, and normally I'm like, overlapping UVs are horrible. And if you're doing custom textures, they kind of are. Like if you're doing a face, you shouldn't have overlapping UVs. You're gonna end up with like mouths on the forehead and some like really like weird looking stuff. Which sometimes I do because it's honestly just really funny. But like practically speaking, it looks terrible. So if you are doing custom textures for, again, like a face is usually somewhere where you wouldn't necessarily do something like this with overlapping UVs. But for just sort of generic textures like walls, ground, etc., you can overlap UVs to the high heavens in games, and it's not really going to do anything bad. And then I did like pretty much a similar thing for this. Exact same model, I just shifted the UVs over and twiddled them around a bit to make the hay and give it like a tiny bit of variation. But I mean, that's kind of the beauty of texture atlases. You can just sort of swap stuff around pretty easily. And it also leads me into kind of the other thing that I wanted to go over, which is tiling. But before I get to that, are there any questions on texture atlases? Cool. Again, just like make sure, if you do a texture atlas, if you want to do this for your final or for a game or whatever, just make sure that like whatever resolution you're using is reasonable. Like as an example, so if you're doing a top-down angle like this, it probably makes way more sense to dedicate more of that texture space to your roof texture, since that's like most of what you're going to be seeing. Versus something like this where you're like, I'm just like running around like I'm an ant, and you're mostly going to be like hanging out like on the ground and seeing mostly the walls. So you have to think a little bit about like how does it make sense to actually use that texture space. But it's really like kind of up to you and what you actually need to do, and also again the angle of whatever camera you're using to actually play your game. The other thing I just want to like go over really quick, and this is like not a super fantastic example of modular textures, I suppose, but I was all, I'm going to make a super cute little town, and then I'm like, I have things that I need to do, and this is kind of going to take way longer than I have. But you'll notice that I've basically made each wall separately. I was very lazy and I did a planar map, so you can see texture stretching here. But I made like basically different variations of walls, so like square window, door, circular window, and like no windows. And basically what I can do for this is if I wanted to, I could sort of like combine these in different ways, a little bit kind of like a Minecraft-y style almost. And just be like, cool, like I want a room with a bunch of square windows. So I just take that window and basically like make 3 versions of that window instead of having to model a completely separate building and then UV that separate building. A lot of times game assets will do this kind of thing where they'll just sort of make one sort of generic like piece of an asset that can be reused in multiple places and then just sort of like mash them all together in the end. Because it does save a lot of time in terms of like UVing, modeling, all that good stuff. Any questions on that? Cool. So the other thing that I just want to go over really quick is kind of similar, but if you ever need to do like tiling textures for your ground and stuff. So I'm just going to I made this like horrific looking little ramp shader. Where am I going? Blah. I'm using Lambert's because I'm lazy and not rendering this. Huzzah. Alright. So I have this like weird tileable texture thing that I found. Yeah, cool. So I found this thing on the interwebs, and just off the bat, it looks pretty ridiculous. The cobblestones are like larger than the houses. and then if you zoom in, like, it also looks, you know, from like pretty far up, it looks pretty trashy in terms of resolution. So this is like obviously not desirable on a number of levels. If I was in Maya, my default fix for this, since I literally just Googled like cobblestone, like tileable cobblestone texture on Google, and this is like the third thing that came up. But anywho, so again, if you're using a tileable texture, my go-to in Maya is to just go into this Place 2D texture node by the file, and just be like, repeat it over and over. Great. And now I have tiny tiles. If I scroll in, it takes way longer for them to get like super icky resolution, and the scale is significantly less disgusting than it used to be. That being said, if you port this out of Maya into something like Unity or Unreal, whatever numbers that you entered into that little Place 2D texture node may or may not have some kind of comparable thing, so they might not transfer over. And then you'd basically be stuck with whatever the heck this awfulness is. So the other thing there's basically two ways to fix this. The first is to do something truly horrible that'll probably make you hate yourself. And that is to go into Photoshop and like manually tile that texture yourself, which I have done here. And I literally just took the texture and just duplicated it like 5 times, so you can see like this is the original texture. You can see the size difference in that. So again, if you want to do this, you can. It's kind of gross. It takes forever. And it's honestly, like, drives me nuts. I hate doing that. I used to, and then like, so this is that texture that I manually tiled in Photoshop. And again, you can see like the size is definitely better than it was before. But as soon as I scroll into maybe about, you know, this level, it does start to get like noticeably grainy. And that's basically because at this point I'm scrolling in on like a really tiny area of this and basically trying to stretch like 200 pixels over my entire screen, so it looks gross. Same basic principle as I say, like, oh, there's like texture stretching on, you know, stuff you've been making for animation or whatever. Same principle here. There is, however, a much nicer and pretty easier way to fix this that will actually transfer over into Unity. And be a little bit more optimized in terms of texture size, because like to do anything useful with this, you need like at least a 2K texture. And this is like a fairly small ground plane. If you're doing like a whole city that you're doing, you're gonna need like a 10K texture if you want to lay it out like this, which is, I'm not gonna lie, I tried to do that once for some reason at one point, and I literally couldn't use my laptop with Photoshop with 10K texture. So like it's horribly optimized. Anyway. So the better solution in this case, I'm just going to swap back my original texture, my giant cobblestone texture, is to actually just go and modify your UVs and basically stretch the ever-living crap out of them so that they do what you need. So in this case, and this again kind of breaks my rule of like don't put stuff outside the UV texture grid. And if you're doing custom textures, that still totally applies. But for tiling stuff like grounds, this is actually pretty commonplace. So if I just like scale these up like super aggressively, you can see that again the scale of my bricks is pretty reasonable, and if I, you know, the closer I scroll in, it's not like horrible looking yet. You have to get pretty close before it gets like really icky looking. And again, that's just because I scaled my UVs up, and also because of how the UV editor works, which is pretty much how any UV editor works, like in Unity, Unreal. They all pretty much work the exact same way. And because this is based off of, like all the textures are based off of this UV grid and the size of your UVs, if you modify this and like put it into Unity, whatever changes you made here are going to carry over correctly. And you don't need to worry about, you know, changing a bunch of settings to like hope your textures link up properly or something. But basically, in case I haven't gone over this before, because I get extreme deja vu, is for the UV grid, so if you throw a texture in, by default, it's going to display that texture between 0 and 1 in this, basically wherever it's displaying this texture right now. This one little box here, that's where it displays the texture by default. Any other of the, you can see there's like sort of the darker outlines around some of these boxes. Each of these boxes here, like here, it's displaying this exact same texture, basically just in a different spot. So it automatically is kind of like tiling itself for you. It's just not showing you that it's tiling. if that makes any sense at all. It's kind of a weird description of that. But you can actually see, so if you ever want to expand where this is displaying, you can go to Image and Image Range. And this is, again, in your UV editor. And I'm just going to set this to like -1, -1, 2, 2, and 2. I'm not going to lie, I kind of always forget exactly what these numbers are, but usually I just sort of plug things in. But you can see that it's gone through and basically displayed the texture. It's not like stretching the texture or anything like that, it's just showing how that texture is actually tiling in those other surrounding boxes. So if you ever need to look at that, you can. It might help you get an idea, like if you see like a weird stray texture on your stuff, it might help you sort of track that down. In this case, I'm just going to set this back to the defaults because I find this very awkward to look at. One. Dear God. Buttons. There we go. All right. Cool. So again, pretty much all I did to accomplish this is just stretch the UVs. And this works, again, this is like pretty not terrible way to do things for a few different reasons. So again, it's going to work pretty much no matter what if you put this into whatever program, because textures are all pretty, like, the UV system is pretty much standard. So there's no worrying about like, oh, do they have a place 2D texture node that's going to show up kind of thing. But it's also nice because you can start with a relatively low resolution image. And since it's just repeating over and over, you do have to get pretty close before it starts, the quality starts breaking down. So it does become a lot more efficient. Like, you know, before I mentioned, oh, you'd have to do like a giant 10K texture for a whole city. You don't need to worry about that kind of efficiency when you just sort of stretch the UVs super huge. So any questions on that? All right. I had another half point. Oh yeah, that was it. So just make sure, so like when you do this, do make sure that like you choose a texture that tiles reasonably. So like in this case, if you scroll out, you can see maybe a little bit of a repeating pattern, but it's not like completely horrible. I, just for grins, went through and found a texture, in this case this dude, which does not tile well for a number of reasons. Looks real gross. There's a few different reasons that this doesn't tile well. For one, it was a rectangular image, so Maya is pretty much cropping off the side, so even if it did actually tile as a rectangle, it no longer tiles as whatever this like mushed square version is. You'll also notice just, and this goes for like if you're making your own textures or finding ones on the interwebs. It's good, especially for tiling textures, to avoid these areas of like really, really, you know, sort of dark shadows in one area, really high or like really bright highlights in another. Because for one, like if the seams join up like this, it makes a really clear, obvious line, for one. But also if you zoom out, it does kind of create that like kind of gross effect where it's like you see like it makes like a very obvious sort of repeating grid. And if that's like the aesthetic of your game or whatever, like that's totally fine. If you're doing something, you know, realistic or whatever for your scene, this might not be quite what you want. So it is a good idea for your tiling textures to usually go through and try to keep them relatively uniform in terms of lighting and that kind of stuff. And then also obviously make sure that they actually, you know, the seams line up if they are tiling. And it should be fairly straightforward to find tiling textures. Google has like 1,000,001 of them, and for the most part they usually do tile well. Again, if you're finding Google textures, just make sure that you're finding stuff that's square. Because even if this does wrap correctly, if you like, you know, tile it manually in Photoshop, Maya's going to cut off part of this image. So, you know, the side can't match up with the side if it doesn't exist. So do just make sure that you are, again, at least finding something square. Any questions on that? All right. So like I said, there's actually like more fun, dandy UV things I can show you. You can actually, you can apply multiple UVs, like multiple sets of UVs to the same object, and have different textures on that object affecting different UV sets on it, which is really good for like doing weird stuff like baking ambient occlusion into a whole environment. But again, I need to go over how to do that a little bit more in the updated version of Maya, because it's been a super long time since I've had to do that. In case any of you just want to like Google it on your own time, It's just called like UV sets, basically. But yeah. So any questions about any of the UV stuff I just went over for gamey stuff? All right. In that case, the next thing that